Power in the criminal underworld usually announces itself loudly. It arrives through violence, fear, and spectacle. That was how most mob bosses built empires, and that was exactly why they underestimated Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. His genius was never about being the strongest man in the room. It was about being the most patient. And the first move in his greatest play began long before anyone realized a game was even being played. Harlem, in the early years of Bumpy Johnson's rise, was not a battlefield yet. It was a prize. Italian mob families looked at it as territory waiting to be absorbed, its numbers racket a cash machine that should belong to outsiders with more men, more guns, and deeper political connections. On paper, Harlem had no chance of resisting. Bumpy Johnson understood that reality clearly. He knew he could never defeat the mob bosses by fighting them the way they fought each other. That understanding shaped everything. Instead of confronting power directly, Bumpy studied it. He watched how mob bosses behaved when they felt unchallenged and how they reacted when profits slowed. He learned that greed made them predictable and arrogance made them careless. While others focused on controlling streets, Bumpy focused on controlling outcomes. His genius play was not about expansion, it was about positioning. The first step was restraint. Harlem did not erupt in open conflict, and that was intentional. Violence would have justified invasion. Chaos would have invited federal attention and mob intervention at the same time. Bumpy ensured that Harlem remained quiet enough to appear manageable but profitable enough to remain tempting. That balance confused outsiders. They could not justify a full takeover, yet they could not ignore the money being made. This was the trap. Bumpy allowed the mob bosses to believe Harlem was already slipping into their orbit. He avoided public challenges. He did not declare independence. He let intermediaries negotiate. These negotiations were never meant to succeed. They were meant to gather information. Who wanted what? Who was impatient? Who needed results quickly? Every conversation revealed weakness. While mob bosses measured strength in numbers and territory, Bumpy measured it in leverage. He recognized that his greatest advantage was Harlem's stability. The neighborhood functioned smoothly because disorder was bad for business. That smooth operation made Harlem appear less threatening, which lowered defenses. Mob bosses are most vulnerable when they believe control is inevitable. Behind the scenes, Bumpy strengthened relationships that did not look like alliances. Community figures, numbers, bankers, business owners, and political intermediaries were not soldiers. They were stabilizers. They created a network that could absorb pressure without fracturing. This network did not announce loyalty. It demonstrated reliability. Reliability made Harlem valuable, not just profitable. The mob bosses failed to see that value clearly. To them, Harlem was a resource, not a system. They did not understand that disrupting the system would collapse the resource. Bumpy understood that perfectly. His genius lay in making his enemies dependent on the very balance they intended to destroy. As profits flowed, mob attention increased. But instead of meeting that attention with resistance, Bumpy met it with accommodation. He allowed limited access. He shared just enough to keep interest alive while retaining control of the core operations. This created an illusion of progress for the mob bosses. They believed time was on their side. Time was actually working against them. Every month that passed without violence strengthened Bumpy's position. Harlem became known as stable, profitable, and surprisingly disciplined. That reputation reduced the appetite for aggressive takeover. Mob bosses prefer easy wins. Harlem stopped looking easy. It looked complicated. Complicated territories attract negotiation, not invasion. This was not accidental. Bumpy had designed it that way. The most dangerous part of this phase was how invisible the strategy remained. Even people inside Harlem did not fully understand what was happening. They simply experienced continuity. Life went on. Businesses operated. Families survived. That normalcy was the shield protecting the strategy. Outsiders mistook calm for weakness. Insiders mistook it for luck. Bumpy knew better. He also knew that this phase could not last forever. mob bosses would eventually demand more. They always did. Greed does not accept equilibrium. It demands growth. Bumpy's first move was never meant to win the game. It was meant to set the board. By the time the mob bosses realized Harlem was not surrendering quietly, they were already entangled. Their money flowed through systems they did not control. Their reputations were tied to profits they could not risk losing. Walking away would look like failure. Attacking would threaten their own income streams. Bumpy Johnson had turned survival into strategy without firing a shot. And this was only the opening move. What the mob bosses did not realize was that while they believed they were closing in on Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was preparing the second move, one that would force them to choose between profit and pride, a choice that would expose their greatest weakness. Once the board was set, Bumpy Johnson shifted from patience to pressure, quiet pressure that never looked like force. The mob bosses believed Harlem was gradually falling into their hands, but in reality, they were being trained to rely on it. This was the second phase of Bumpy's genius play, and it was far more dangerous than open confrontation. Mob power thrives on momentum. Once profits begin flowing from a territory, backing away becomes psychologically and financially difficult. Bumpy understood this instinct better than the mob understood him. Instead of blocking access to Harlem's economy, he engineered controlled dependence. The numbers game continued to expand, but always through channels that remained locally anchored. Outsiders touched the profits, but they never touched the machinery. This distinction mattered. The mob bosses began counting Harlem revenue as part of their future projections. It appeared in discussions, expectations, and internal power balances. Removing that income would weaken their standing with allies and rivals alike. Harlem quietly became too valuable to destabilize. That value was not just monetary. It was reputational. A stable, high-performing territory enhanced the perception of competence for anyone associated with it. Bumpy allowed this perception to grow deliberately. He permitted intermediaries to report success upward, reinforcing the illusion that control was inevitable. These reports were not lies. Money was flowing. Order was maintained. No scandals erupted. The absence of problems was the problem. Mob leadership could not justify drastic action against something that appeared to work better than expected. Behind the scenes, Bumpy refined Harlem's internal discipline. Small disputes were resolved before they escalated. Unreliable figures were removed quietly. Excessive violence was discouraged because it created noise. Harlem became predictable, and predictability is addictive to organizations built on risk. It lowers stress. It stabilizes income. It dulls suspicion. The mob bosses began treating Harlem less like a hostile frontier and more like a dependable asset. That mental shift was critical. Assets are protected differently than threats. You do not burn what feeds you. You do not destabilize what supports your position. Bumpy Johnson understood that greed narrows vision. Once people believe they are winning, they stop questioning how. That complacency allowed Bumpy to strengthen alliances that did not look like alliances at all. Local figures gained autonomy within defined boundaries. They operated efficiently because efficiency benefited everyone. Harlem became self-regulating in a way outsiders did not recognize as power. The genius of this phase was subtlety. There were no dramatic moments, no public victories, no declarations. Just a steady normalization of Harlem operating on its own terms while outsiders collected enough profit to feel invested but not enough control to interfere. Mob bosses are conditioned to respond to resistance. They are not conditioned to respond to cooperation that quietly limits their reach. Bumpy's approach inverted their expectations. He removed the enemy they were prepared to fight and replaced it with a system they did not know how to dominate without destroying its value. This forced hesitation. Hesitation spread upward. Decisions stalled. Requests for deeper involvement were delayed. No one wanted to be responsible for disrupting a profitable equilibrium. Harlem became politically inconvenient to challenge. That inconvenience was Bumpy's shield. The more dependent the mob became on Harlem's stability, the more leverage Bumpy accumulated without appearing to hold any. He never demanded concessions. He let circumstances demand them. When mob interests conflicted internally, Harlem profits became a bargaining chip they were unwilling to sacrifice. This was the turning point. Bumpy Johnson had transformed a position of vulnerability into one of quiet indispensability. Harlem was no longer just territory. It was a stabilizing force inside a volatile criminal ecosystem. Removing it would ripple outward unpredictably. That unpredictability terrified mob leadership more than confrontation ever could. Yet this phase also carried risk. Dependence breeds resentment once recognized. Bumpy knew that eventually someone would realize the imbalance. Someone would see that Harlem was not drifting into submission but solidifying into autonomy disguised as cooperation. That realization would not come gently. It would trigger a response driven by pride rather than profit, and pride makes people reckless. Bumpy Johnson was counting on that recklessness because it would expose weaknesses that greed had hidden. The second move had succeeded. The giants were dependent. Now all that remained was to see which of them would panic first. As the mob bosses began to sense that Harlem was no longer moving towards submission, one decision driven by wounded pride threatened to unravel everything, forcing Bumpy Johnson to execute the most dangerous move of his life. Greed had blinded the mob bosses. Dependence had softened them. But pride is what finally exposed them. Bumpy Johnson understood that while organizations run on money, individuals are driven by ego. The third phase of his genius play began the moment profit was no longer enough to satisfy wounded pride. The shift was subtle at first. Requests for greater control over Harlem increased, not demands but suggestions, not orders but expectations. Mob leadership began asking questions that revealed impatience rather than strategy. Why were decisions still being made locally? Why was enforcement handled internally? Why had full integration not occurred yet? These questions were not operational. They were emotional. Bumpy recognized the change immediately. This was the moment he had prepared for. He did not resist openly. He did not accelerate concessions. Instead, he slowed everything down. Delays increased. Processes became more layered. Communication was filtered through additional intermediaries. Each delay felt like inefficiency, but it served a precise purpose. It amplified frustration. Frustration weakens judgment. One mob boss in particular interpreted these delays as disrespect. He believed Harlem's stability was proof that Bumpy could be replaced without consequence. This belief was reinforced by advisors who underestimated the neighborhood's internal discipline. They saw order and assumed it would survive disruption. They did not understand that the order existed because disruption had been prevented, not because it was harmless. The decision that followed was driven by pride rather than analysis. Pressure was applied through intimidation, not full-scale violence, but targeted signals. Increased presence, threatening visits, attempts to bypass local systems. Each move was intended to reassert dominance. Each move achieved the opposite. Harlem's stability wavered just enough to attract attention from other interests. The balance Bumpy had carefully maintained began to strain. And that strain was the point. Bumpy Johnson allowed the tension to surface publicly just enough to reveal the mob's involvement without triggering chaos. Law enforcement attention sharpened. Political allies grew cautious. The mob boss responsible for the pressure suddenly found himself exposed in ways he had not anticipated. His pride-driven actions had created visibility. Visibility is lethal in organized crime. Other mob leaders recognized the danger immediately. They saw how close the situation was to drawing unwanted scrutiny. More importantly, they saw that the disruption was coming from within their own ranks, not from Harlem. This realization shifted internal dynamics. The boss who pushed too far became a liability. Bumpy had not attacked him. He had simply allowed him to reveal himself. The genius of this phase was that it required no direct confrontation. Bumpy did not threaten retaliation. He did not escalate violence. He let the system react naturally to reckless behavior. Harlem's calm response contrasted sharply with the mob's aggression. That contrast reshaped perception. Harlem looked disciplined. The mob looked unstable. This inversion was devastating. Once internal confidence fractured, mob leadership began reassessing priorities. Profit returned to the center of discussion. Stability regained importance. Pride was reframed as risk. The boss who had pushed hardest found support evaporating quietly. No one defended him openly. No one wanted to share responsibility for his decisions. Bumpy Johnson had forced the mob to police itself. This was the move that turned the entire game. By provoking ego rather than greed, Bumpy exposed the mob's weakest link: internal rivalry. He did not defeat them directly. He let them undermine themselves. Harlem emerged from this phase, not as conquered territory, but as a cautionary example. It demonstrated how quickly profit could be threatened by arrogance. Mob leadership adjusted behavior accordingly. Control was softened. Interference decreased. Negotiation replaced pressure. The board had shifted completely. But this moment carried its own danger. Humiliated power does not forget. The mob bosses did not forgive the embarrassment. They retreated strategically, but resentment lingered. Bumpy Johnson knew that long-term survival would require more than tactical victories. It would require insulation against revenge. The game was no longer about outsmarting individuals. It was about outlasting institutions. And the final moves were approaching. As wounded pride turned into silent resentment among the mob bosses, Bumpy Johnson prepared his most permanent safeguard, one that would protect Harlem even after his own power faded. The smartest defenses are the ones no one recognizes as defenses at all. After watching mob pride collapse under its own weight, Bumpy Johnson understood a hard truth. Tactical wins expire, but systems endure. If Harlem was going to remain protected, it could not rely on constant maneuvering or personal influence. It needed insulation. Not walls, not weapons, something far more durable. This phase of Bumpy's genius play was not about outsmarting enemies anymore. It was about making them irrelevant. Instead of centralizing power further, Bumpy dispersed it deliberately. Authority did not sit in one office or one figure. It was embedded into routines, expectations, and unwritten rules. Harlem began functioning like a self-correcting organism. Problems were addressed early. Excesses were discouraged quietly. Stability became habitual rather than enforced. Outsiders misread this decentralization as weakness. In reality, it was the opposite. Removing a single point of control made Harlem harder to destabilize. There was no switch to flip, no leader to eliminate, no dramatic act that would collapse the structure. Everything worked because everyone understood their role, even if they did not fully understand why. This was Bumpy's long game. He strengthened relationships that looked mundane on the surface. Business owners, local figures, intermediaries, and political contacts were treated as stakeholders rather than subordinates. Their success depended on Harlem's stability, which aligned their interests naturally. Loyalty did not need to be demanded. It emerged from shared benefit. The mob bosses struggled with this concept. Their power models depended on hierarchy and fear. Harlem's model depended on predictability and mutual survival. Disrupting it required more effort than it was worth. Any aggressive move risked cascading consequences that no one could fully control. Bumpy also understood visibility. He kept Harlem's operations deliberately unremarkable. No excessive displays, no dramatic expansion, no headlines. The quieter Harlem appeared, the safer it became. Federal attention drifted elsewhere. Mob leadership lost urgency. Time passed, and urgency rarely returns once it fades. This phase reshaped Harlem's reputation permanently. It was no longer seen as a rebellious stronghold or a takeover target. It became known as a place that functioned smoothly, but resisted intrusion effortlessly. That reputation spread informally, through experience rather than warning. What made this strategy brilliant was its humility. Bumpy Johnson did not try to immortalize himself. He made himself less essential. That decision protected Harlem from the one vulnerability every criminal empire shares: dependence on a single figure. Yet, this approach came with a personal cost. As Bumpy embedded himself into the background, his visibility diminished. His influence became harder to trace. Outsiders assumed he was fading. Some insiders believed the same. That assumption was dangerous, but Bumpy accepted it. Power that announces itself invites challenge. Power that blends in survives. The fortress without walls worked because no one could see where it began or ended. Harlem continued operating through transitions, pressure, and change. It did not require constant correction. It adjusted. That adaptability became its greatest defense. Mob bosses eventually understood that Harlem could not be taken without being broken and breaking. It would destroy the value they wanted. Bumpy Johnson had achieved something rare. He had turned a vulnerable neighborhood into a fixed point in a volatile ecosystem, not through force, but through design. But even the strongest systems face one unavoidable threat: time. Bumpy knew that no structure lasts forever without renewal. New generations question old rules. Memory fades. Discipline erodes when consequences feel distant. The final challenge was not external enemies. It was what would happen when Bumpy himself was no longer there to reinforce the quiet principles that held everything together. And that question loomed closer than anyone realized. As Harlem became structurally untouchable, Bumpy Johnson confronted the most dangerous question of all. What happens to a perfect system when its architect begins to disappear from the center of it? The most dangerous move in any long game is not the final strike, but the decision to stop playing visibly. By the time rival mob bosses realized that Harlem was no longer reacting to their pressure, Bumpy Johnson had already reached the end game. There were no dramatic announcements, no public confrontations, no final battles. That absence was the point. This was the silent checkmate. Bumpy's genius was not measured by territory seized or enemies defeated, but by conflicts that never happened. Mob leaders stopped proposing Harlem takeovers not because they feared retaliation, but because the math no longer worked. Risk outweighed reward. Every path led to complication. Every move created uncertainty. Harlem was stable, predictable internally, and unpredictable externally. That combination is fatal to expansion-minded criminals. What made this victory extraordinary was that it did not look like victory at all. From the outside, Bumpy Johnson appeared less dominant than before. He was not expanding. He was not escalating. He was not making noise. That illusion disarmed adversaries. They interpreted restraint as decline. In reality, it was consolidation. Bumpy had already secured what mattered. Everything else was excess. This final phase of his strategy relied on patience, something most mob bosses lacked. They chased momentum. Bumpy cultivated endurance. They sought visible control. He prioritized invisible influence. Over time, this difference reshaped the balance of power in New York's criminal ecosystem. Harlem became the exception. Other territories fluctuated with leadership changes, arrests, internal betrayals, and federal pressure. Harlem adapted quietly. When enforcement tightened, activity slowed without collapsing. When attention drifted, operations resumed smoothly. There were no spikes, no chaos, no patterns that invited scrutiny. It functioned like a regulated system rather than a criminal enterprise. Mob bosses noticed this consistency and misunderstood it as stagnation. They did not realize they were looking at the end state of a completed strategy. Bumpy Johnson had outgrown the need to prove anything. This maturity was unsettling to rivals because it removed leverage. Threats had no effect. Negotiations lacked urgency. Provocations went unanswered not out of fear, but because they were irrelevant. When you refuse to react, you control the tempo. When you control the tempo, you control the outcome. Internally, Harlem understood this shift instinctively. The rules no longer needed enforcement through fear. They were self-sustaining. The community had learned how stability felt, and it resisted disruptions naturally. That cultural reinforcement was something no outside force could replicate or dismantle. Bumpy's legacy, therefore, was not dominance, it was normalization. Harlem stopped being contested because it stopped being chaotic. It became boring to predators, which is the highest form of protection. As time passed, newer mob figures came up hearing stories of Bumpy Johnson without fully understanding him. They inherited myths, not lessons. They respected the reputation but failed to grasp the system behind it. That misunderstanding ensured Harlem's safety long after Bumpy stepped further into the background. His genius play was complete when Harlem no longer needed him at the center. The irony is that this success made his role almost invisible. History remembers explosions, betrayals, and dramatic downfalls more easily than quiet victories. but those who study power closely recognize the difference. Ending conflict permanently requires more skill than winning it temporarily. Bumpy Johnson did not just outsmart mob bosses, he outlasted their thinking. In the end, there was no moment when the mob admitted defeat. There was only a gradual withdrawal, a collective decision not to engage, not to challenge, not to interfere. Harlem was left alone not because it was feared, but because it was no longer worth destabilizing. That is the mark of a true strategist. And that is why Bumpy Johnson's genius play remains one of the most overlooked masterclasses in power, restraint, and control. The real question isn't how Bumpy Johnson defeated the mob bosses, it's how many modern power players are still losing battles today because they never learned when to stop fighting and start designing outcomes.